once again, we'd like to turn to Psalm 37. We'll read the first 8 verses, very familiar passage of Scripture. Psalm 37, verses 1 through 8. Fret not thyself because of evildoers, neither be thou envious against the workers of iniquity. For they shall soon be cut down like the grass, and wither as the green herb. Trust in the Lord, and do good. So shalt thou dwell in the land, and verily thou shalt be fed. Delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart. Commit thy way unto the Lord. Trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. And he shall bring forth thy righteousness as the light, and thy judgment as the noonday. Rest in the Lord, and wait patiently for him. Fret not thyself because of him who prospereth in his way, because of the man who bringeth wicked devices to pass. Cease from anger, forsake wrath. Fret not thyself in any wise to do evil. Again, this is a psalm of David, written in his elderly years. We know that from verse 25. He says, I have been young, and now am old. The specific occasion in which the psalm is written is not mentioned. But in the psalm, David deals, as we've already said this morning, with the avoidance and the overcoming of a spiritual peril, and that is to envy the wicked. In our text, he mentions the particular peril, and then he gives directives to avoid it, to overcome it. The foundational truth of the psalm is basically life is all about God. And in order for this to be so, there must be a satisfaction in God. If God is to be our life, we must be satisfied with the Lord. We must find, again, satisfaction in God. That means we must find fulfillment in God. If you find fulfillment in God, you won't go running every place else. It's to find contentment in God, gratification in God. So our subject is satisfied in God. Satisfied in God. Spoke earlier of enjoying God. The two go together. If we're satisfied in God, we'll enjoy God. If we enjoy God, we'll be satisfied in God. So consider the setting of the psalm. The setting of the psalm is one of wickedness and evil. The word wicked occurs 14 times in this psalm. 13 times with reference to people. One time referring to an activity. That's in verse 7. There's the word evil 3 times in the psalm. Again, referring to activity and conditions. There is the word evildoers 2 times. The phrase workers of iniquity 1 time. The transgressors 1 time. So you have the wicked, the evildoers, the workers of iniquity, the transgressors. These are the enemies, the haters, the despisers, the deniers of God, those who rebel against God, those who are offended by God, those who have disregarded, rejected, dismissed, and evicted God from their lives. And in verse 12 we read, the wicked plotteth. That is, they scheme, they conspire, they devise against the just or the justified. That is, they are an opposing force to God's people. And then notice, and gnasheth upon him with his teeth. They're filled with hatred. They're filled with resentment and rage. In verse 14 we read, the wicked have drawn out the sword and have bent their bow. That speaks of their intent. And then it goes on to say, to cast down the poor and needy, and to slay such as be of an upright conversation. In verse 32, the wicked watcheth the righteous, and seeketh to slay him. So it appears from all of this that there was an open hatred, there were threats, there was defiance of the wicked against God's people. There was agitation, there was fury, there was wrath, there was outrage, there was resentment by the wicked, the evildoers, the workers of iniquity, and the transgressors against the people of God. This is nothing new. This has been going on since the fall. They were a menace. They were an obstacle to God's people. And they crowd and lurk in the path of life, and they appear day by day. They are a source of many problems. They are a source of many trials and difficulty and suffering to the people of God. And as a result, God's people are exposed to a peril, to a danger. Having said that these are the source of many problems, they're not the reason that God's people fall in the spiritual peril. You can't blame your spiritual condition on other people or on the times in which you live. It's just not accurate. It has no scriptural basis. In addition to all of this, there was the propensity there was the prosperity and the ascension of the wicked and the evildoers and the workers of iniquity and the transgressors. So this 37th Psalm is composed in an atmosphere that was very perplexing to people of faith. In verse 7, in the context of evildoers and workers of iniquity, we read of him who prospereth in his way. That is, these people, they were flourishing. They were thriving in their wicked, evil, and iniquitous ways. And in verse 16, we read of the riches of many wicked. And in verse 35, David declares, I have seen the wicked in great power. That is, I have seen them in places of authority, places of influence, places of dominance, spreading himself like a green bay tree. David says they're like a tree, spreading itself in every direction, spreading its limbs and branches far on every side. He conveys the idea of their power and prosperity just growing and growing and growing. They're rising higher and higher, ascending in life, extending their influence. And it's in this setting that the psalmist writes this psalm. And it's in this setting that the tendency for the child of God is to merely see things on the surface, the suffering and the difficulty of God's people, and seeing the seeming prosperity and ease of the wicked, and the evildoers and the workers of iniquity and the transgressors, and losing sight of the Lord. All of that resulting in a state of anxiety, a state of worry, a state of agitation, a state of distress and discouragement. So this is a psalm very much for our day. Again, what we see today, in general, has been going on since the fall. There is great peril for the child of God. And this is addressed in our text in verse 1. He says, "Fret not thyself." And it's repeated twice in verses 7 and 8. So 3 times in this setting, you have these words, "Fret not thyself." Now the word fret conveys the idea of being worried, being distressed. It's an ongoing state of agitation and disturbance. It's a state of vexation, a state of complaining. Notice that it's not merely fret not, but it is fret not thyself. That is, it's something that we do to ourselves. The word fret comes from the root word meaning to gnaw away, to eat away. So we see the effects of this fretting. It's of a corroding and decaying nature. In other words, it destroys. So it's no wonder that David wrote 3 times, "Fret not thyself." This is a peril of God's people. And what follows is another peril of God's people. "Neither be thou envious." Refers to a state of uneasiness, painfulness, seeing the prosperity or the happiness of another, in this case, the wicked. Job 5, verse 2, we read, "Envy slayeth." Proverbs 14:30, we see that envy is the rottenness of the bones. So just like fretfulness, it is destructive to one's own being. So both of these, fret and envy, are in the context here in Psalm 37 of evildoers and workers of iniquity. Notice it says, "Fret not thyself because of," and then it mentions evildoers. There are 2 sins mentioned here in verse 1, fretfulness and envy. Verses 7 and 8, fretfulness is twice more mentioned, but there it is connected with anger and wrath. So you have 4, fretfulness, envy, anger, and wrath. And those 4 present 4 perils for the child of God. And in reality, they are a cyclic thought loop. The danger is becoming trapped in this loop of fretfulness, envy, anger, and wrath. It just goes round and round and round. The peril is that we become focused upon the wrong thing. In this case, the evildoers, the workers of iniquity, and their prosperity. Fretfulness, envy, anger, and wrath are a loop that hooks and engages us, and it is deadly to spiritual living. So the psalmist is addressing this. And the first thing he does is direct our focus to the Lord. Life is dependent largely upon our central focal point. That is, the way we live life has a lot to do with our central focal point. Our focal point, to a large degree, determines the manner and nature of our life. There's no getting around it. Our focal point shapes our thoughts and our life. And we can be sure of this if we are in a continual state of fret because of evildoers. We have a wrong focal point. We have a wrong focal point. Throughout this 37th Psalm, our focus is directed to the Lord. Notice the prepositions with regard to the Lord. In verse 3, verse 4, verse 7, you read the words, in the Lord. And in verse 5, in Him. Also in verse 5, unto the Lord. In verse 7, for Him. In verse 9, upon the Lord. In verse 34, on the Lord. The focal point is God. And then throughout the psalm we read such phrases, He shall. In verse 4 it is, He shall give thee. In verse 5, He shall bring it to pass. In verse 6, He shall bring forth. In verse 34, He shall exalt thee. In verse 40, He shall help. He shall deliver. He shall save. Also we read in verse 17 and 24, the Lord upholdeth. In verse 18, the Lord knoweth. In verse 28, the Lord loveth and forsaketh not. In verse 33, the Lord will not leave His own in His, that is, the wicked's hand. We also read that He is, in verse 26, He is ever merciful and lendeth. In verse 39, He is their strength in time of trouble. So the way of escaping this ongoing threat of fear because of evildoers is focus upon God. That's the focus of the psalm. Focus upon God. And then what the psalmist does is he introduces a spiritually healthy loop. If you've got to be in a loop, be in a spiritually healthy loop. Don't be in a destructive loop. So he introduces this spiritual loop. With God as our focus, in the midst of the progress of the enemies of God, David gives some directives. And these directives form this spiritually healthy loop, which will raise us above our surroundings, enable us to show forth God in our life. Again, in this 37th Psalm, we're directed toward God. And there are 9 verses that begin with verbs. 9 verses that begin with verbs. Verse 1, verse 3, verse 4, verse 5, verse 7, verse 8, verse 27, verse 34, and verse 37. These are things that we are to do, all based upon who the Lord is. He's the focus and what He has promised. And this regardless, again, verse 1, fret not thyself because of. But whatever you want, on the other side of because of. In this case, it's evildoers, the prosperity of the wicked. And then he gives us these directives. Verse 3, trust in the Lord. These are not meaningless words. This is not a hollow slogan that you put on a t-shirt or upon a wall. Trust in the Lord. It is a course of action. Trust in the Lord. Remember the context. Trust in the Lord. Recognize and acknowledge God. That He is absolute. That He is sovereign. That He is invincible. That He is the Most High. That He is eternal. He is immutable. He is holy. He is almighty. He is everywhere present. He is all-knowing. He is love. He is merciful. He is gracious. He is faithful. Trust in the Lord. If you believe those things, trust in the Lord. That is, believe God. Be persuaded in God. Have confidence in God. Rely upon God. Look to God. Seek God. Turn to God. Flee to God. Take hold of God. Trust in the Lord. That is, living above and beyond ourselves. Trust in the Lord. He repeats it further down in verse 5. Commit thy way unto the Lord. Trust also in Him. Trust in the Lord. There's energy there. There's vibrancy there. There's power to take you beyond the activities of the wicked, the activities of the evildoers, the activities of the workers of iniquity and the transgressors. Trust in the Lord. It'll raise you above the difficulties and all the inconveniences and all the circumstances and all the trials and all the obstacles and all the impossibilities that we encounter. It'll keep you near to God. Trust in the Lord. That will enable you to stand in the storm and say with Paul, I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. So the direction is, fret not thyself because of evildoers. Trust in the Lord. Trust. And he goes on, the second thing, and do good. Trust in the Lord feeds. Do good. Trust leads to doing. Because if we trust in the Lord, we're going to do what He says. And what He says is good. Trust in the Lord and do good. That is, do what the Lord says. And while you're doing it, do it because you trust in the Lord. And while you do it, trust in the Lord. Just keep trusting in the Lord. And then we come to verse 4, what we preached on this morning. Delight thyself also. That is, in addition to trusting God, and doing good, while you're trusting God, while you're doing good, while you're doing what He says, delight thyself in the Lord. That is, enjoy God. Enjoy who He is. It is do good, enjoying God. It is trust in the Lord, live in obedience to Him, finding your gladness and satisfaction and fulfillment in Him. You're not looking to find your gladness and your satisfaction and your full fulfillment in what's going on around you. You're looking to find your gladness and your satisfaction and your fulfillment in the Lord. Trust in Him. Do good. Delight in Him. Enjoy God. Enjoy God. While the wicked are doing their thing, enjoy God. Fret not because of evildoers. And he goes on in verse 5. Commit thy way to the Lord. Again, everything here, it's a verb and it's in connection with the Lord. Commit thy way. My way. Commit it to the Lord. You won't do that unless you trust Him. Unless you trust Him. Our way is inclusive of every aspect, every detail, every circumstance of our life. It refers to our manner of living. Commit thy way unto the Lord. That is, entrust your life with God. Let go. Hand over. Relinquish all claim upon our lives. Who's going to do that? Those who trust Him. You're not going to hand over your life to someone you don't trust. So it all comes back to trust in the Lord. Relinquish all claim upon our lives. Do we trust Him enough to just let go? To let go of our lives and say, here it is, Lord. Do as you see fit. It's yielding the totality of our being and life to God. You know, people say all the time, I recommitted my life to the Lord. And I like to ask them, what does that mean? I'm just curious. What does that mean? And you'd be surprised what that means to a lot of folks. Commit thy way unto the Lord. Well, it means that God's throne is established in our hearts. We've handed it all over to Him. What commit thy way unto the Lord means to a lot of people is, I told God I would do such and such. Well, you haven't committed anything. Turn it over unto God. He tells you what to do. You don't tell Him what you're going to do. It's living in light of His ownership and His authority, in submission and obedience to Him. It's living life dedicated, devoted to Him. Not for what we can get, not because it makes us feel good, but for His honor and glory. Commit thy way unto the Lord. That is, you take every aspect, You take every detail of your life with the attitude of, I'm not holding anything back. I give it all. I give it all to the Lord. When we truly trust and obey and enjoy God, the result will be, again, this is a loop, we commit to Him. The problem is, so many try to commit without trusting, without obeying, without enjoying God. Commit is the result of those things. And notice, commit thy way unto the Lord. Everything's moving in the direction of God. By the way, this is more than a commitment to a cause. A lot of people are committed to a cause. This is committing to Him. And it's more than committing time to Him. I recommitted my life to the Lord. What do you mean by that? Well, I'm going to give Him a day of the week. This is more than committing time. You can commit time to the Lord without committing to Him. Commit thy way unto the Lord. Then notice verse 7. Rest in the Lord. What that means is be calm in the Lord. And we can be calm regardless of what's going on in the Lord. Be calm in the Lord. You know how calmness is interpreted by most people today? They don't care. If they cared, they'd be all upset. Really. Rest in the Lord. Somebody needs to be calm. Rest in the Lord. In the midst of all the chaos, someone needs to be calm, to be rational. Rest in the Lord. That is, be still in the consciousness of the fact He is the Lord. I can rest in that. I can be calm in that. Rest in the Lord. That is, be still in the consciousness of the fact that whatever the appearances of the hour may be, man and all of life are in the grip of His government. Rest in the Lord. Someone may ask, how do I do that? I try to do that all the time. How do I do that? The answer, trust in the Lord. Trust in the Lord. Trust in the Lord. Do good. Delight thyself in the Lord. Commit thy way unto the Lord. And guess what? You rest in the Lord. People try to rest without doing all those other things. This is a loop. You got to follow the order. Whether I'm able to rest in the Lord is dependent upon trust in the Lord, do good, delight in the Lord, and commit. The rest is further explained in the words that follow. Wait patiently for Him. Again, remember the context. The wicked are prospering. The wicked are ascending. The wicked are in control. Be still. Wait patiently for Him. It's not wait for the wicked to fall. It's wait patiently for Him. That's the focus. Him. Again, that's not easy to do. But it is if you trust Him. And if you've committed your way to Him, it's not difficult at all. But without doing those things, it's an impossibility. So wait patiently for Him. Then he repeats it. Fret not thyself because of him who prospereth in his way. And in this case, the wicked, the evil. Again, in verse 9, it is repeated. For evildoers shall be cut off. They shall. They're not going to last forever. But those that wait upon the Lord, they shall inherit the earth. That's a promise. Again, verse 34. Wait on the Lord. And while you're doing that, keep His way. That is, continue to do what He says as you wait. As you wait upon God, you do the right thing, is what He's saying. And this is further understood, this rest, by verse 8. Cease. That means halt. Stop. Quit. Terminate. Cease from anger. You look at the wicked, the evildoers, they're prospering. Cease from anger. And forsake. That is, leave it. Wrath. What this is saying is, cease from self and self ways. Well, how do I do that? Trust in the Lord. Trust in the Lord. Do good, that is, do what He says. Find enjoyment in God. Commit your way to the Lord. Turn it all over to Him. Rest in the Lord. Wait, that is, enduringly for Him. What a blessed cycle and loop to be in. So you read through the loop, and then it just starts over all again. That's what a loop is. This is where we need to live. Each verb feeds the next. And then it starts over again. What we read here gives stability. The times, of course, all the chaos, gives a sense of instability. Society is in a state of instability. There's no doubt about that. Anyone with an ounce of sense can see that. It's in a state of instability. But God's people should never be unstable. Should never be in a state of instability. And they won't be if they trust in the Lord. Get in this loop. So what we read in our text gives us stability. It enables us to stand. It gives us courage. It gives us resolve. It gives us determination. It gives us perseverance and endurance. What we read in our text, read it over and over again. It simply keeps our mind upon Him and our feet following Him. What we read in our text will keep us in His Word and will keep us from sin and will give us strength and will give us comfort and will give us joy and will give us peace. Again, every day we see and we hear things that just makes our blood boil. But you can't continue in that state and remain spiritual. It won't happen. Trust in the Lord. Get in this loop. Get in this loop. It'll keep us from being mastered and controlled and governed by circumstances. It'll keep us from being mastered, controlled, and governed by what's going on all around us. And this loop also helps us. Not only helps us, it causes us to bow and to worship God. Living in evil times, as described here in this 37th Psalm, God's people ought to bow more. God's people ought to worship more. God's people ought to focus more upon God. So what we read in our text is contingent upon our conception, our perception of God. And then that creates an attitude toward life itself. Again, we're not going to do any of these things unless we're satisfied in God. Do we find satisfaction in God? Are we pleased with God? Do we enjoy God? Are we satisfied in God? If I enjoy God more than anything else, and I find satisfaction in God more than anywhere else, I'm not going to wander from Him. I'd be foolish. This is so important that we enjoy God, that we are satisfied, that we find fulfillment in God. I'm not being fulfilled. And on it goes. Where are you looking for fulfillment? Where are you looking for it? That explains why you're not being fulfilled. How can you not be fulfilled in God? Satisfied. Satisfied with God. Brother Ben, if you come and lead us in a verse of song.